So thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here and to have a chance to talk to you about this paper, which is part of a larger project with Holger Kern at Florida State. We started working on this a couple of years ago for reasons that you'll see as I get into it. It took us a couple of years to actually get a first paper together because the data work involved was fairly time consuming. The question that this first paper tries to think about, I bet this must be, see if it now will work. There we go. The problem that this first paper tries to think about is a problem that's fairly common in circumstances in which you're making a transition from an authoritarian to a democratic regime, right? So here you've got the examples of a Ba'athist party convention in Iraq. Here you have a Stasi member arresting somebody trying to cross the border in East Berlin. And the problem that we're focused on is the question of what to do, right, once you've made this transition to a democratic regime with officials who worked under and worked for the authoritarian regime in the past. Do you exclude them from public service? Do you exclude them from political life? Do you try to reintegrate them in some way? And this is obviously a huge challenge. And if you read the literature on transitional justice, most of which really developed in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's a surprising consensus, right, sort of driven in particular by people like Jan Elster and Samuel Huntington to some extent, that the right policy is to let bygones be bygones, and that you should sort of close the door on the past and try to reintegrate these people as much as possible, both for reasons having to do with sort of the way in which the new regime will be perceived, right? So are you imposing victor's justice essentially on the former regime, and that might be a bad thing, but also, and this is the point that we're really going to attack, because you're sort of in a catch-22. Rebuilding a democratic regime means you need to provide good governance, but providing good governance requires you to have officials who are able and have the expertise to do the sorts of jobs that need to be done. You need police forces, you need security forces, you need civil engineers, you need bureaucrats, right? And inevitably, many of the people who have those skills and that skill set are people who were entangled with the previous regime and worked for it. And so part of the argument is it's better to draw on the expertise that these people have rather than exclude them from public life. And the obvious question, it seemed to Holger and me, is, well, what are they going to do, right? If you choose to retain them and reintegrate them, how are they going to behave? Will they in fact use their expertise in ways that are conducive to reestablishing a democratic regime or not? And there's surprisingly little work on this. There's a lot of work that looks at how do transitional justice regimes translate into democratic stability, into sort of public opinion and approval of a new democratic regime. But there's virtually no systematic work that tries to sort of look at how do former officials behave if they're retained. And so we try to do this in the context of a particularly, to us, salient case, which is that if you look at the West German judiciary following World War II, a significant number of judges who served in the West German judiciary had extensive ties to the Nazi regime and to the Nazi judiciary, and continued to serve in the West German judiciary for many years. And so in this first paper, we look at the impact of that legacy on the trials of individuals accused of Nazi crimes or NS-related crimes in the 1950s and 60s. Now, to be fair, initially, after the collapse of the Nazi, or the defeat of the Nazi regime, there was on the part of the Allies and the new German government an effort and a desire to limit the influence of former Nazi officials and collaborators in the new democratic system. And so denazification was the vehicle for trying to achieve that. It was initially administered by the Allies, and so there was some variation across the zones of occupation. It was relatively quickly turned over to German authorities to administer. And once that happened, both kind of the efficacy and the determination with which denazification proceeded sort of dropped significantly. There were practical challenges, but also tremendous political opposition. Also, remember, this is the context of the Cold War. And so the Western Allies very quickly become worried about trying to integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. And since denazification is one of the very controversial things within Germany, essentially by 1949, it is dropped. Officially, it doesn't end until 1951, but essentially by 1949, denazification is a dead letter. And almost immediately, the quote I have actually is a little bit before, the impact of this on the judiciary becomes clear. So this is just a sentence taken out of a report written by the American commissioner in charge of reestablishing German courts. And he's writing back to the State Department in 1947 and notes the percentage of politically incriminated judges and prosecutors is increasing alarmingly and is cause for serious concern. Right? And so politically incriminated obviously here means people who are tied to the Nazi regime. All right, now the question obviously is, so you have this legacy of these judges, and I'll show you some numbers on that in a moment. But one question is, would you expect that legacy is going to have an effect on judicial decision making or not? And that, in essence, right, sort of since we're in a judicial context, is a question of motive and opportunity, right? So would these judges be motivated to act in ways that are different from judges that wouldn't have that kind of background? And if they're motivated that way, do they have an opportunity to act on those inclinations? So I want to take those two things in turn. The first thing to note is that tainted and untainted judges, and I'm going to use those terms to mean, right, a tainted judge is somebody who has ties to the Nazi regime, and an untainted judge is one who doesn't. They're likely to differ ideologically, right? And there are probably at least two reasons for that. One is just the simple selection effect, right? So somebody who's become entangled with the Nazi regime has chosen to do that, and presumably people who choose to become entangled with the Nazi regime are ideologically, right, on average, closer to the regime than people who choose not to make that or not to take that step, right? So there's just a selection effect that distinguishes these judges. And the second is a preference formation effect, right? So to the extent that people's values and ideological commitments are shaped by professional and educational experiences, you would think that a judge who's become entangled with the Nazi regime is exposed to sort of preference formation opportunities that a judge who hasn't had that same experience wouldn't have, right? And so again, that would point to the likely ideological differences between tainted and untainted judges. Now, the second sort of equally important question is, suppose these judges do differ ideologically, could that affect judicial decision-making? And that, in essence, is a question of the legal landscape, right? So what are the constraints under which these judges operate? And here, there are a couple of important things with respect to the particular decisions that we're interested in, which are these prosecutions for alleged Nazi crimes. Those crimes were prosecuted under two different legal regimes. The first one, I'm not going to say a whole lot about. We can talk about it during the Q&A if you would like. There's some really interesting things about it. The Allied Control Law number 10. The reason it's in parentheses is that law basically controls prosecutions in several Western occupation zones, but only until the early 1950s, and then it's scrapped. And after the early 1950s, which is the period in which we begin our study, only the German Criminal Code of 1871 can be used to prosecute these crimes. And the reason why that's relevant is that if you look at the relevant paragraphs of that criminal code, they allocate sort of central importance to the subjective state of mind of the perpetrator. Right? So let me give you a couple of examples. The difference between Mord, right, so murder, and Totschlag, manslaughter, under German law, turns on the following thing. In order for you to be convicted of murder, the killing has to be accompanied by at least one of four elements of the crime. The killing has to be done for base motives. It has to be committed in treachery. It has to be particularly cruel, or it has to be committed in order to hide another crime. Right? So one of those four elements has to be present in order for you to be convicted of murder. Critically, all of those things are evaluated with respect to the subjective mind of the perpetrator. So for cruelty, the question is, if I kill somebody, do I believe that I'm doing it in a particularly cruel way? It's not whether you think it's cruel, it's whether I am trying to do it in a way that to me seems cruel, okay? Similarly, there's which in this context obviously is extremely important, the legal defense of Befehlsnotstand. Right? I was just acting on orders. But in order for you to use that defense or for a judge to reject that defense, the question is, did you believe the order to be illegal? Right? You as the perpetrator. The standard is not, as it would be under Anglo-American law, would a reasonable person know that the order is illegal? It is, did you know it was illegal when you did it? Which obviously, all of these things open up tremendous room for judges to interpret the subjective state of mind of the perpetrator. Right? If as a judge, I come to the conclusion that sure, right, a reasonable person would know that what you were being told to do is illegal, but I don't think that you knew, then that allows me to let you go, right? So that the fact that the subjective state of mind is so important here really opens up tremendous judicial discretion. And so let me just give you a particular example to show how this operates in practice. The gentleman, if one can call him that here on the left, is Paul Wenneker, who was an admiral in the German Navy, and he was the naval attaché of the Nazi regime in Tokyo, and in that role was responsible for organizing basically convoys of materials and supplies going from Japan to Nazi Germany. And in 1943, he issues the so-called drown order, under which he says, if your ship is in danger of being captured by the Allies, you as the captain are obligated to scuttle the ship, right, to sink it. You can take yourself and the crew off the ship, but anybody who is held in the brig of the ship, right, the prison, has to be left in the brig and has to go down with the ship. And it doesn't matter why they're in the brig. If they're in the brig, right, they drown with the ship. He's finally put on trial in Hamburg in 1966 for murder for that order. The case for which he was tried was one in which the person in the brig, I think he was 21 or 22 years old. He had been picked up in Tokyo. He was a merchant marine guy on one of these ships, had been picked up for dealing in black market watches. And he was put in the brig and drowned with his ship. So he's tried in 1966. And here's what the judges in that case decide. They said, well, look, the question is, which of these four elements is present? He didn't do it to hide another crime. It certainly wasn't treachery because he announced to the world that he was issuing this order. It wasn't done from base motives because he thought he was acting as a government official. So that only leaves cruelty. But Vanberg is a guy who's raised in naval traditions. And for somebody raised in naval traditions to go down with a ship on the high sea is actually an honorable death. And so to Vanberg, this does not, like to you and me, it might seem cruel, but to him, this certainly wouldn't have been cruel. And therefore, he cannot be guilty of murder. He can only be guilty of manslaughter. And of course, the nice thing about manslaughter is that it has a statute of limitations of 15 years. And so the judges say, look, that means he may be guilty of manslaughter, but the statute of limitations is passed anyway. So he walks out of court a free man. But so you can really see like the extent to which the discretion, I think, afforded by the criminal code matters a lot here. Right? So I think the judges potentially have motives. They certainly have opportunity. Will it matter? Right now, one sort of, I think, obvious kind of expectation would be that, sure, it will. Right? If these judges ideologically feel closer to the Nazi regime and they're sitting in judgment of somebody who committed crimes purportedly motivated, at least in part, by that ideology, they might be tempted to go easy on them. And I think a lot of literature in judicial politics would lead to that expectation. Now, it turns out that there may be a different answer, though. Right? There is also a good amount of literature, some of which has looked at judges, others that has looked at other collaborators of authoritarian regimes that argues kind of the opposite. And Elster, as I said, he's one of the big proponents of let bygones be bygones. Qualitatively has pointed to a number of examples of this in the context of Eastern Europe, in which the argument is, look, former officials or collaborators of the authoritarian regime may feel that they are under particular scrutiny and that for sort of self-serving reasons of advancing their career, they're going to be particularly careful not to make decisions that could be interpreted as kowtowing to their former masters, right? And so that it's particularly the tainted officials who might be sort of resistant to go easy on these people, right? And so in that sense, you might expect that tainted judges aren't going to be any different in judging these crimes. Perhaps, Elster might say they might even be more aggressive in dealing with people accused of them. Right? All right. So, how do we look at this? I know we see if I can do this in about 15 minutes. Obviously, the first thing we've got to do is figure out who is a tainted judge, who has ties to the Nazi regime. This turns out to be harder than you might think. There are sort of thousands and thousands of judges in lower courts, obviously, in the 1950s and 60s. And there is surprisingly no systematic database that will allow you to sort of look up, right, who were people who either had Nazi Party membership or served as officials or in some capacity of the Nazi regime. There is a card catalog in Berlin of Nazi Party membership. But if you want to know whether somebody was a Nazi Party member, you have to go there. You have to request the name, and they will give you 50 index cards surrounding that name. And then alphabetically, you have to look through to see whether the person you're looking for is actually in that stack, right? So it's impossible to kind of figure out for thousands of people were they Nazi Party members or not. So instead, what we do, which is more limited, is we take advantage of work by a German historian who provides some biographical data on the legal training and legal careers of German judges. And so from that, what we're able to see are two things. One is the judge somebody who already served as a judge or prosecutor during the Nazi regime? Or two, is this judge somebody who completed their legal education, including the second state exam in law during the Nazi period, right? And so obviously this is just a restrictive set of ties you could have to the Nazi regime, but it is what we can get. Now we do think it's reasonable in the following sense. If you look at what the Nazis do almost immediately after coming to power, to the judiciary and legal education, it's really impressive. Right? In many areas, they actually take sort of several years. With respect to the legal system, they move extremely quickly. So within a couple of months, they have fired a third of all the law professors teaching in Germany and replaced them with people that they have appointed. Law students who are not ideologically sympathetic to the Nazi regime are either expelled, or many of them leave of their own accord because they realize what's coming and that their opportunities are going to be very limited. Law students are actually required to become members of subordinate organizations to the SA and the SS. Legal training now begins to incorporate ideological training as part of law school education. And there's a huge transformation of legal scholarship to sort of begin to bring Nazi ideology into the way law is taught and interpreted by judges, right? So in that sense, we think if you become entangled with that right legal system, that's probably a pretty good indication that you've chosen to become entangled with the regime. For reasons I can talk about later, we think that legal education is actually a better measure than service as a judge or appointment as a judge. And I can talk about why that is if you're interested. For the crimes or our trial data, we draw on this very really unique and incredible collection put together by two Dutch historians that basically has the trial or the judicial decisions of all alleged NS crimes that either intended or resulted in the death of at least one person. Right, so it's not covering all NS crimes, but it's covering the most serious ones. And so it's been extended, it's still going on. But they started putting this together in 1968, going back to the late 1940s in terms of the trials. We focus on this period from 52 to 64 because it matches our biographical data. There are, a little more than 200 trials, about 500 defendants. There are more defendants than unique defendants because some people get tried twice for different crimes. Importantly, we treat somebody as convicted only if they are both convicted and a prison sentence is imposed. Because one of the sort of tricks that judges during that period used was to say, well, we convict you, but there's no sentence attached to it. And people walk out of court. All right. What we're interested in here as a first step are the first instance trials. So when you go to trial, are you going to be convicted or not? I can talk about prison length sentence at the end if you'd like me to, but the first thing we're just going to look at is, are you going to be convicted or not? One complication here is that the trial records do not tell us which judges participate in which trials. So the only thing we know is you were tried in this particular court. We know who the judges were that were assigned to that court, and we know that those judges are split up into panels randomly, and that the cases are assigned to the panels randomly, typically by the last name of the defendant. And so that means that in a certain sense, if we look at the court as a whole, the share of tainted judges serving in the court as a whole is a good proxy of the likelihood that you're being tried in front of a panel that involves some of these tainted judges. All right. What we're going to look at here is just a probit model. Right? So we're just going to model the probability of being convicted. And the key covariate for us is going to be, what's the share of tainted judges who are assigned to that court in the year in which you're being tried? We have a number of sort of ways of trying to deal with potential confounders here. Right? So one thing I'll talk about a little bit because it's sort of interesting is we distinguish the cohorts of untainted judges, because if you think about it, the tainted judges are the ones trained or who were appointed during the Nazi period. But that means the untainted judges are ones that were either appointed after the Nazi period or trained after the Nazi period, or there could be some really old judges who were already appointed during the Weimar Republic. We actually have a couple in here who were still appointed before World War I during the German Empire, or who were trained before the Nazi period. So there are two different sets of untainted judges, and so we're also going to distinguish between those two. We include fixed effects for the year, the state, the nature of the crime. The year, because the legal standard changes a little bit over the course of the period here. And then there's sort of a number of robustness checks that I can talk about during the Q&A if you're interested. All right, so here I just want you to see this very quickly. Obviously, this doesn't tell us a whole lot other than the stars are in the right place, right? So this is a probate model. The percentage of judges who were trained during that period significantly reduces the likelihood of conviction. If we distinguish now in the second model, the untainted judges, one interesting thing that emerges is that the judges who were trained prior to 1933 actually look more likely to convict, even than the judges who were trained after 1933. And it's one of the things we're trying to disentangle. I've got some thoughts about why that is that I'm happy to speculate on. But what you really want to know is what's the substantive impact of this, right? In terms of size, what are we talking about? And the sizes are substantial. All right, so here is just a first difference graph showing you if we go from the 10th percentile of the distribution of tainted judges to the 90th percentile, which roughly corresponds to a court that has about 26% of the judges with a Nazi legacy, to a court that has about 55% of judges with this kind of legacy. Right? The probability of conviction drops by about 30 percentage points. And given that the probability of conviction on average is just about 60%, right? It's basically a reduction by half of the probability that you're going to get convicted as you're moving across that space, right? So really, I think, pretty tremendous impact. Now, one of the things you might wonder about is, well, this is what happens in the trial courts, but there's an appeals process, and both defendants and under German law, the prosecution, right, which you couldn't do under American law, but under German law, the prosecution can appeal too. So you might wonder, does this get corrected as the case moves up in the appellate process? And here, there's sort of a difficulty. You might think about this in two different ways. Here, I'm just going to show you a very simple way of doing it, which is to say, we're not going to worry about the characteristics of the appeals court and who the judges are there. All we're going to do is run the same model we already ran, but substitute in the final verdict that you got. Right? And so the question basically is, does the appeals process correct the final verdict and these effects wash out? And the answer is no, right? Again, you see sort of the significant results in exactly the same places. So the final verdict still, right, means that you're much less likely to be convicted if your initial trial took place before judges that were more tainted. All right, so let me try to wrap up here. There are a number of things that we think sort of matter here. One obviously has to do simply with the particular historical situation that we're interested in here, and that is that it's pretty clear that the decision to retain a large number of judges with ties to the Nazi regime had a substantial impact on accountability for Nazi crimes, right? If you are an accused perpetrator, your chances of escaping conviction increased dramatically if you found yourself in a court with a higher percentage of judges who had these ties to the Nazi regime. It's likely that influence extends to other cases as well. There's a new book that some of you may have seen. It's gotten very good reviews on Auerbach, Philipp Auerbach, who was a sort of German Jewish survivor of Auschwitz, who ultimately settled in Munich and became an important sort of organizer and spokesperson for trying to revive Jewish life in Munich. And he was, during the 1950s, ultimately brought up on bogus charges of embezzlement and so forth. And it's pretty clear, if you look at the historical record, that this was orchestrated by prosecutors who themselves had ties to the Nazi regime. In any case, it sort of destroyed him personally, to the point that he ultimately committed suicide. And so this kind of influence probably extends into other areas as well. We're just able to show it here in this very particular area because that's where we have data. We think there are also some broader conclusions that follow from this. And one is that the optimism, I think, in the transitional justice literature, that you should just let bygones be bygones and retain these officials because you can use their expertise, that may just be too optimistic. Now, it doesn't mean that every case is going to work out the way that this one did, but I think there probably should be more thought given to, what reason do we have to believe that these people are going to act in ways that are conducive to reestablishing a democratic regime. It obviously also raises broader questions of the rule of law, right? If you're in a situation in which accountability for crimes varies so tremendously by the background of the particular judges that you find yourself in front of. Finally, there's sort of the question, right, which I think has implications for contemporary cases too, which is, was this inevitable, right? When you're going through an authoritarian transition, right, do you need to rely on former officials? In a certain sense, I think that's the strongest case for saying you should let bygones be bygones, right? Sometimes you may be in a catch-22 in which the people who have the expertise that you need simply happen to be the people who did those jobs under the previous regime. And maybe, right, you have to make a deal with the devil, so to speak. And I think we don't want to say that that's wrong. Right? There may be circumstances where you are forced to deal with former officials or collaborators. But at the same time, we think that shouldn't sort of obscure the fact that at the margin, there are significant political choices to be made about the extent to which you have to rely on them. So for example, right, the pool of untainted people is in part a function of the choices that you made. The German government decided in early 1951 that people who had a previous civil service affiliation or job in Germany during a prior German regime had privileged access to civil service employment. And that meant that many people who'd worked for the Nazi regime essentially skipped the queue ahead of people who left Germany and gone into exile and then came back. That was a political choice. You didn't need to do that, right? One might also think about, to the extent that you have to use them, how do you use them, right? One of the things the Nazis did, who, by the way, faced this problem too, right? The reason they didn't fire all the judges and all the law professors is because they didn't have enough to fill those jobs. They also had to retain some. But what they did systematically was to move people that they considered politically unreliable into assignments where their political convictions were less important, right? So you might go from criminal court to family court or traffic court or whatever. And the same thing is true here, right? Maybe you need these tainted judges, but do they need to sit in criminal courts that judge these kinds of cases? And then finally, one might think more broadly about institutional designs that could mitigate this kind of impact, right? In this case, the traditional appeals process obviously didn't work, but maybe there are other ways of trying to oversee and control some of these effects. Just quickly, the next thing we're going to do is actually take a closer look at the appeals process by going to examining the decisions at the highest Court of Criminal Appeals. And we're also trying to think about whether or not there are ways of extending this into other areas of law that are less directly tied to the Nazi regime. So with that, I will be quiet, and I look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Georg. Great to have you here. Let me start with those of you over here in terms of questions. I'll then go online, and then I think we'll have some questions on this end of the table. If you have a question, come on. Please.
I think you mentioned that there was a higher chance that becoming tainted if you became a judge as the Nazi regime came to power than if you were taught under that regime and then became one. But and you said you would mention it later in questions. I guess this is my lead in terms of kind of that.
Sure, right. So that if this is not what you're asking, let me know. But I think what you're asking is we have these two measures, right? One is you were appointed as a judge or a prosecutor by the Nazis, or you got your legal training under the Nazi regime, and we like that measure better. And as a matter of fact, those are the only results I showed you here. The reason for that essentially is the following. If you think back to your kind of high school algebra Venn diagrams, right? The set of people who were appointed as judges by the Nazis is basically a subset of the people who were trained under the Nazis. There are very few people that the Nazis appointed as judges that were not also trained during the Nazi period. And so we're basically using the larger set by using the people who were trained during the Nazi period. And we think that's more reasonable because many of the people who trained as lawyers presumably went into careers in the Nazi state that didn't necessarily involve being a judge or a prosecutor, right? If you worked for one of the Nazi ministries, for example, that wouldn't be reflected in being appointed as a judge or a prosecutor, but clearly you're entangled with the Nazi regime, right? So to that extent, we think it's just a cleaner measure. The second thing is if you look at the number of people who are trained under the Nazis and who then become judges or prosecutors, that percentage is very high. And then it begins to drop off with the beginning of the war, because many of the people who get a deferment while they're in law school then are drafted into military service after they leave. And so instead of going into the judiciary, they go off to war. But there's still people who chose to go to law school during the Nazi period. So that's why we like that measure better.
If I didn't misunderstood, while you were showing the results, you said that judges that were appointed before the 33, they were kind of more strict on the outcomes of the process. Why is that? Do you have any thought about it?
I do have some thoughts about it, but this is pure speculation, and it's one of the things that we're sort of trying to figure out, is there a way of testing this more systematically? So that the reason, initially we were very surprised by that finding because the common perception of the German judiciary during the Empire and then during the Weimar Republic is that it was highly conservative, that the people who served in it were largely associated with sort of right-wing nationalist parties who were thought to be, in many ways sympathetic to at least some elements of Nazi ideology. So we found that surprising. In retrospect, and now thinking about it, and this is why we have to find an independent way of assessing this, here is one thing that I could imagine, right? Many of those judges, even if they were relatively conservative or sort of right-wing, whatever term you want to use for them, they are probably people who think in terms of law and order, right? And one of the things about the crimes that are being prosecuted here, many of them are crimes that are NS related. They're clearly most of them committed by Nazi officials, but in a way that to a conservative law and order judge might seem lawless, right? So for example, the most prevalent crime category we have are crimes in which during the final weeks and days of the war, a local Nazi official executes prisoners in his that he has, or they summarily execute suspected deserters, or summarily execute somebody who's sort of suspected of looting after a bombing raid. And so I could imagine that one of these conservative judges looks at that and says, well, of course they should be punished, but punishment requires that there's a legal process. There has to be a trial and a conviction and so forth. We can't just have, officials shooting people on the street. And that might be part of what's going on, right? But again, that's just speculation.
Somebody online? Does anybody online have a question?
Same
Please.
line, expanding a bit on the stuff you mentioned. You mentioned the Allied Control Law number 10. Could you maybe expand that? I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, so the Allied Control Law number 10, it's when you first, or category of crimes we think about now today, crimes against humanity. My understanding is that the origin of that was in the Allied Control Law number 10. And so this was a law passed by the Allies months after the end of the war that authorized prosecutions for crimes against humanity. And so a lot of the initial trials that took place under that legal authority, particularly in the French and the British zones of occupation. But that law was sort of highly controversial in Germany, and especially controversial in German legal circles, including among people who clearly had no affiliation with the Nazi regime and had, in fact, been in the resistance. And the reason was that, to their legal understanding, this seemed like an ex post facto law, right? You come in here as the occupying force, and then you give a vague phrase like crimes against humanity, and you begin prosecuting people, many of whom are just saying, look, I was doing what was legal and mandated, in fact, by the Nazi regime, and and so that kind of discussion was so politically heated in Germany, and opposition to it, even among people who were not sympathetic to the Nazi regime for that reason, was so intense that ultimately the Allies decided the better way to do this was to scrap that law and take it back, and instead put the prosecutions under the German Criminal Code of 1871 as it was revised by the Nazis, because that way you couldn't say this wasn't law on the books at the time, right? As a matter of fact, those 4 elements of murder under the German Criminal Code, which is another sort of atrocity here, were introduced into the German Criminal Code during the Nazi period by the state secretary in the Justice Ministry. And that state secretary was none other than Roland Freisler, who ultimately becomes the chief judge of the Volksgerichtshof. And so if you've seen the YouTube videos of the crazy Nazi judge screaming, that's him. He was the state secretary in the Justice Ministry who redrafted the murder statute and added those 4 elements to the paragraph.
As a beginner, I would like to know, like, at the moment, is still so subjective, German law, or has it been changed?
No, that is still, right. So that paragraph is still the murder paragraph, and the legal interpretation is still that it's the subjective state of mind of the perpetrator that counts.
Very good. Tom,
thanks, George. I found this absolutely fascinating, really, really well done. And a few analogies came to mind. There's the Monica and Aleppo book, Skeletons in the Closet. Yeah. So the post-communist efforts at figuring out who was complicit in the old regime, and the Inga Morovitz book on imperfect justice, with that, for me, memorable sentence where the West Germans came and met with all the East Berlin judges and prosecutors and said, Sie hatten keinen Rechtsstaat, sie hatten einen Unrechtsstaat. And the point she makes is a lot of the judges were involved in family law and civil law, which was not so political. Yeah. And so I took that as related to the point you made about the potential for reassignment. Yeah. The third is a book by an American named Brian Puaka in 2009 on education at the schools after the war. And you had a similar problem. All these teachers were products not necessarily of the Nazi regime, but of a highly authoritarian understanding of relations within the school, relations in the state. And one of the interesting things he says was to remake schools and civic education, it was not just a matter of changing textbooks, but introducing these American type institutions like student assemblies and, democratizing the culture in the classroom.
Yeah.
So that goes to those institutional changes you were talking about.
Yeah.
Really. And so you have to imagine the community of judges, it gets democratized in its style, in its political culture.
Yeah. No, that's really, I did not know that, or do not know that, folks. So I'm going to have to find that, because that sounds and in that context, presumably at least a little easier to do than in this context, right? This highly sort of professionalized and at the very top. So it turns out, one of the things for this new paper that we're working on the Bundesgerichtshof, the problem of tainted judges in this early period gets worse as you move up the judicial hierarchy, because of course, once you get to the highest court of appeals, these are judges who've had decades of legal experience. And so, well, where were they during the Nazi period? Right? There are a few of them that come back, Jewish emigres who come back and then end up serving, on the Bundesgerichtshof and on the Bundesverfassungsgericht with these people who'd been, Nazi judges, including, there were separate judicial chambers during the Nazi period for racial defilement cases. And they're sitting there with these judges who served in those courts. Yeah.
You were talking about Jewish that came back to serve, but doesn't it raise the opposite problem? Because obviously they, I suppose, would be biased too on the opposite side. So they would be probably way stricter and biased.
Sure.
Not a kind of problem, right?
Sure, right. So and there's some kind of fascinating evidence on this, which sort of, just if I can say just a couple of words, so we look at the probability of conviction. We don't look at the length, or we do look, but I didn't talk about the length of the prison sentence that is imposed if you are convicted, because you might expect that judges are also going to be a little more lenient with respect to that. We don't find that. So with respect to the prison sentence, conditional on being convicted, there is no difference. And the interesting thing is, so this is where we get to your question now, there's a fascinating set of papers done by a couple of economists for Israeli courts, where the question is, to what extent do Jewish judges in Israeli courts and Arab judges treat defendants differently? And there you have exactly the same findings. So they look at cases of preventive detention. Right, so is somebody placed in preventive detention? And there's huge biases in both of these directions with respect to whether or not you place somebody in preventive detention. And so Arab judges are much less likely to do it for Israeli Arabs, and Jewish judges are much less likely to do it for Jewish defendants. But conditional on being placed in detention, there's no difference in the length that's ordered, which is sort of interesting. I've got some thoughts on that. But
I have a question for you too, and I'd like you to talk a bit more about selection effects. For me, that's something that's clearly there. When I see that 1/3 of judges are dismissed, what's the criteria of judge? Clearly religion's going to be one. So if you're Jewish, I assume you're just simply dismissed. Is there an ideological tinge, or what is this? How does that then affect who is allowed to study law in 33 to 40? Is it the same standards that used to dismiss judges than the ones that are there? And the people know this when they get in. That's the first sort of selection effect. The second is thinking a bit about geography, which is where are most of these cases happening. And you mentioned it's when people, kind of towards the end of the war. Well, there are some parts of Germany that have those shootings. And there are other parts that actually are fairly, if you're in Constance, you're too close to the Swiss border, you're never bombed, as far as I understand. You never have to, soldiers show up, they kind of tell me, they kind of start out the war. To what extent could this then be correlated with kind of the brutality at the end of the war, or these other sorts of things?
Yeah.
Geography based. I can come up with other stories about geography too, but I think the question really is geography and selection.
Yeah, no, they're both good questions. So that on the selection effect, your instincts are right? So the judges who are dismissed and law students who are dismissed are obviously anybody who's not an Aryan, right? Which primarily means Jewish judges and law students. Membership in any left-leaning party. If you were a social democrat, certainly if you had any affiliation with the Communist Party, that was an immediate grounds for dismissal. For the other parties, it becomes, sort of more an individual judgment, usually from the records I've looked at, interestingly, by the kind of local official above you, right? So there are these inquiries that come in from the Gauleitung that say, Hallerberg, how politically reliable is he? And if I write back and say, well, yes, he was a member of the DVP, but I have every reason to believe that he's reliable, then you were probably okay. So there seems to be a lot of discretion for the cases that are not as obvious as being sort of Jewish or communist or social democrat. So I think there are certainly those selection effects. The geography thing is interesting. So that where you are prosecuted is not a function of where the crime was committed. It's a function of where you as a defendant are resident. And so you are tried in the court that is responsible for the area in which you are a resident, which of course in many cases is going to coincide with the area in which the crime occurred, but not always. There is, I'll just show you this. You won't be able to see much other than that you can see there's a lot going on here, right? So these are just box plots of the distribution of these tainted judges. For each line is one of these local courts. And you can see, right, so we've got sort of, because it's over a 10-year period, what's the lowest percentage you had during any year, what's the highest percentage, and then kind of the mean and the sort of two standard deviations, or I guess one standard deviation. And the only, obviously you can't make out any details, but the point is just, there's tremendous variation across these courts, both across courts at the same time, but also within the same court over time, in terms of the number of tainted judges. And so that's really the thing that's giving us the leverage here. And the fact that these cases are randomly assigned to the, one thing you might, in terms of selection effects, worry about is there something about the courts that have a higher number of tainted judges, that they are in locations that might have had higher support, say, for the Nazi regime, the population was more supportive, therefore you have more. And that might matter because in addition to the professional judges, who are the people we can look at, you also have the 6 lay judges sitting on these cases. And if they're drawn from the local population, we might sort of have a spurious effect here, right, essentially of public opinion coming in by the back door. So in one of the supplementary analyses, what we do is to essentially construct a variable that gives us the local support for the Nazi Party in the last sort of reasonably free elections, both in 1929 and then in 1932, as kind of a proxy for what's the regional support here for the Nazi Party, and controlling for that doesn't change any of these results, right? So it's a crude measure, but sort of the best that we could think of.
Okay, this was scheduled to run till 6 o'clock. It is indeed 6 o'clock.
Thank you.
I want to thank you very much again for your very stimulating presentation. Like the audience for some great questions. And is there something else to say? So for us or for somebody else? Maybe it's for somebody else. I don't think we have, we made this a little earlier in terms of how things run. Let me just say thank you again for coming and for your presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate
I learned a lot.
the opportunity. So,
Thank you.
All right.